while that's going on, you've got one of the other houses being Republican or Democrat. So that's divided, or both houses. So if you think about President Trump, his first 2 years in office, he had a Republican majority in both houses. So he got much of his agenda that he wanted at that moment passed. Although, critics will say his biggest shortcoming with Congress was they didn't repeal the Obamacare law. All right. But other things he wanted to do, like a tax cut, for example, got passed. President Biden will probably throw out a lot of stuff here in these first couple of years because he's concerned that Congress might change hands. So if Obamacare was passed in the first 2 years of President Obama's administration because he had Democratic House and Senate. After his first 2 years, he had a Republican Senate. And from then on, it was obstruction. He got very little passed after that. So that's one of the hardest things about being president is if the Congress isn't your party, then all you really have to rely on are what are called executive orders. And there are not that many of those historically done before. So Wilson is going to have the good fortune of having a majority Democratic House and a majority Democratic Senate, which means the bills he wants passed are going to get passed. When that happens, the president really becomes the leader of the party. At times, the president is usually considered the leader of the party anyway, but his agenda, and that's what's on these two horses here, on these plowed horses, is a House and Senate, both saying under Democratic. And that means he's going to get whatever reforms he wants done passed. Now, I do want you to remember also that Wilson was a Southerner. Okay, now he didn't go to school in the South. He went to school at Princeton, right? But he grew up in Stanton, Virginia. Y'all know where Stanton is? Well, it's really more like the mountains of Virginia. It's in the Shenandoah Valley. If you know where Harrisonburg is, like James Madison University, Stanton is right there. And so he grew up very sympathetic of the men in gray, the Confederates. So this fella is, while very much an elite, educated, scholarly kind of guy, he is also a son of the South, meaning he is in no way, and I said this yesterday, no way progressive when it comes to sort of traditions of African-American progress. So in that area, he's definitely not progressive, right? But he's also a traditional Democrat in a sense that his sort of intellectual foundation is on states' rightism. Or he's not a fan of a strong central government. He's much more steeped in Jeffersonian democracy, which is, the best government is that government which governs least. So that's kind of tricky to be both Jeffersonian and a progressive. Like, how do you pull that off since progressives want to use government as a means of reform? So we're going to be looking at that and saying, what is it about Wilson that makes him able to accomplish these things? Now, another hallmark of Wilson that will last throughout his presidency, and most Americans who know Woodrow Wilson know World War I. Like that's what they know, World War I. Like, if they know anything about Wilson, it's that. And that's certainly fair. That will totally dominate his second term. But his first term is more about a domestic agenda called the New Freedom. But one of the things that's interesting about Wilson, and I mentioned this yesterday, is he's a Presbyterian. I've always enjoyed Presbyterians. They're interesting people that I've met. So if you don't remember what Presbyterian is, it's Scottish Calvinism. So these are the folks that came over here from the Scottish Highlands who were very independent-minded and very fiercely loyal to their community. And the thing about Calvinists, and particularly this Calvinist, Woodrow Wilson, is that once they make up their mind, they can become very, very stubborn. All right, they believe that God is on their side, right? And so, unlike Teddy Roosevelt, who's very loud and brash, TR was capable of compromise. You understand? TR came from a political background where you worked with people from both sides of the aisle. Wilson is coming at this with the fierce certainty of evangelical Christian. You understand? Like, he believes in the rightness of his actions as morally sound, and thus and this has kind of become the attitude a lot of Americans have today, where compromise is a dirty word. You understand? We're working with people you don't agree with. It's something they don't want to do. And so Wilson, unlike TR, is not going to bend at certain key points in his presidency, particularly something called the Treaty of Versailles. And that's going to lead to him breaking. By the end of his presidency, he's going to have a nervous breakdown and a stroke. And that's important because it's going to take a huge physical toll on him being president. He also had a heart problem before he became president. His doctor said, you'll never survive the presidency if you run for office with your heart problems, but he did. So anyway, definitely know that about it. And I would say that Wilson was, we would use the term cold fish. You know, that's kind of not very nice thing to say, but I'm a handshaking kind of physical guy. You know, if I meet other guys, I'm slapping you on the back. TR was like this. You know, he was a very, very personable dude, right? Wilson was very standoffish. He's wearing pince-nez glasses. You guys see these things right here? They're called pince-nez that sit on there. So he just looks professorial. And so I've had parents many years say, you know, we always thought you were going to be this old professor dude. We've heard of you. It turns out you seem like a normal guy. You know, well, Wilson seemed like a professor. He was like the professor in chief, very kind of cold and and even like the irony of all that is that in private he was a very sweet, decent guy, like to the people he liked. But it's like he had a private life that was warm, and he wrote love letters, and it was all kind of romantic. But then his personal, his professional demeanor and public demeanor, very cold. All right, but that kind of helped the Dems because keep in mind who's been their candidate the last couple of times. This guy who seems like a hillbilly from Oklahoma, from Nebraska. Like it's country bumpkin. That's the perception a lot of people kind of had of Brian. So Wilson comes in and he gets elected on what is called New Freedom. But once he's president, he has what is called a key central agenda. We would call this the executive agenda. And the agenda for him is to attack the triple wall of privilege of Americans who have gained benefits unfairly, he believes. So the first thing he goes after, which shockingly for a Democrat, is tariff reduction, right? I'm sarcastic there, I hope you picked up on. But this is a serious undertaking of a major reduction in tariffs. So, and he's going to accomplish that, a huge reduction in tariffs. Wilson is going to break with traditions set by Jefferson. Jefferson, when you have what's called today the State of the Union address, you guys familiar with the State of the Union? The president usually comes and speaks to the combined houses of Congress. That is something that Wilson does. Before Wilson, no president since John Adams had addressed the joint houses of Congress. What they had done is just sent a letter over to Congress for the State of the Union, and it would be read into the record, a letter from the president. Wilson, as this sort of preacher professor, goes and sort of lectures the Congress on what he wants them to do. Now, Wilson is very, very smooth and articulate. He's not boisterous and loud like Roosevelt, but he is a very effective speaker. And he also, in many ways, appeals to the American public by this direct address to Congress. So this is the State of the Union, and in it, he demands lowered tariffs. And this is going to take us way back to the below 30% numbers, right? Like the tariff had been high since before the Civil War. The last time the tariff was really low was James K. Polk, right? But what is also noteworthy about this tariff, and I don't think I mentioned it here, and I sure need to, is this tariff is also going to include the first constitutional income tax. Because in our period of President Roosevelt, the 16th Amendment has been ratified. You may recall there was this tariff earlier called the Wilson-Gorman tariff, which had an income tax in it, but that was struck down as unconstitutional. So now you've had the 16th Amendment, which is going to not only reduce tariffs, but it's going to allow for very small tax on people who make money over $3,000 a year. The book points out the average wage earner was less than $800 a year. So you had to make you had to make almost 4 times as much as the average worker to pay any income tax. So our first income tax was very small, but before his presidency is over, income taxes will become the number one source of revenue for the federal government. So the tariff is going to go down, and ever since, income taxes are how our government funds its operations. So when the federal government does the budget, it does it through the income tax, right? And tariffs are going to go almost to non-existent by the 21st century. All right, so definitely know that. Secondly is an enormously important law that has finally come to fruition. and that is the Federal Reserve. All right. So we have been talking about inelastic monetary supply for a long time, right? It gets old. I know hearing about the species circular and learning about the bimetal debate of the 1890s is not the most stimulating of conversation. But you got to kind of understand that's how you get to the Federal Reserve, because what the Federal Reserve is the banker's bank, right? So the nation's banks that are out here today. So it can be Truist, BB&T, or Citibank, or Bank of America, or I don't know, all these big banks that exist, Wells Fargo. So they get their money, initial money that comes to them, the cash, is created by the Bureau of Engraving. So, like, the Bureau of Engraving actually prints money. You get what I'm saying there? So, like, if you look on, I don't know, a dollar bill, let's look on a dollar bill. You'll see on here, Treasurer of the United States on the left-hand side and Secretary of the Treasury on the right. And so this thing is actually like created in the Bureau of Engraving, as is the U.S. Mint creates money that's coins, right? But what happens is, if you look up here at the top of it, you'll see it says Federal Reserve Note, right? Federal Reserve Note. And so if you grab your own dollar, and normally if we were in class, we would do this as a class experiment. We would see if we have all 12 banks here. And I actually have a number 12, which is unusual. I'm holding a number 12. And so when I say number 12, you can see it's like a 12 right here, 12, there's 12, 12, 12, 12 right there, and an L. You see the L? And then the L inside that seal, mine says, which is a 12, San Francisco, California. The most common around here are E's. And E, or number 5, is Richmond, Virginia Federal Reserve. So you have 12 Federal Reserve banks. And so when the Bureau of Engraving makes your money, they then send it out to the Federal Reserve, right? These 12 banks around the country. See each of the regional zones here. And these member banks then loan the money to actual banks. So like banks get, a good deal on how much it costs to borrow money from the federal government. So I'm going to show you the Federal Reserve in Richmond. So the next time you're over there, you'll see this building. It looks like a miniature World Trade Center back in the day. So this is the Federal Reserve of Richmond. I'm putting up here, right there. That's our Fed. The most important Fed, as you might imagine, is in New York City. That Federal Reserve, which is number 2 up there. But it's a 12 bank body, right? 12 Federal Reserve banks. They issue currency this way. So what they do is they create the interest rate that banks borrow money at. So the prime interest rate currently, as of right now, I think is right below, yeah. So it's 3 1/4 currently. Now the federal interest rate, the federal funds rate. So let's go to that. Federal Reserve Prime. The Federal Reserve Prime. No, excuse me. That's Banks Prime. Federal Reserve rate for is currently the federal funds rate is, well, I'm trying to find it. Federal funds rate. Here it is. So it is currently 0.25. So when a bank borrows, so if you're Bank of America or Wells Fargo and you borrow money to in essence put money out, the bank has to get money from the government. So it borrows it at 0.25. So basically that's almost like free money. You understand that interest rates can't go below 0. If they go below 0, they pay you to borrow money. And boy, I'll sign up for that. All right. So nonetheless, the funds rate is so low. That means the prime rate, and the prime rate is what we borrow money at. If the other day, I think this class was the class I was showing my credit rating at like 800 or whatever. That means I get to borrow money at that rate, at 3 1/4, 3.25. And I'll do a little experiment with you if you want to take a moment, because I really do want to explain this stuff. This is like key America stuff here. So if you want to borrow money, okay, which eventually you guys are going to need to, I imagine, unless you're independently wealthy. if you're going to borrow money and you want to buy a house, so how much interest on a 30-year mortgage at 7%? Let's just see if that works. All right, here we go. So I guess you got to add the amount of dollar amount. I'm missing one of my variables there, right? So if a home price, which would be really high for our community, but let's say it's an upper end house for our community, 200,000, okay? And you're going to put down 10%, 20,000. Your family's going to loan you money or something for that, or give it to you. You're not going to calculate this, but you're going to borrow it at 7% because you don't have great credit, right? So your monthly payment is $1,200 a month, right? And when you're done buying your $200,000 house, you will have paid $251,000 more. So I think you can understand that means you're going to pay double whatever you borrowed, over double, even at 7%. So now let's cut it down to 3.25. So you guys remember that number? Now your bill drops to $783 and you only pay $102,000. So while 3.25 and 7 aren't that big numbers, difference on like a ruler or something like that, they're enormous numbers on interest. All right, so you're talking about the difference of over $100,000. So I hope you guys understand that. Like the rate that interest is borrowed at is absolutely crucial. So imagine if you're some of the foolish people who borrowed money at a variable annual percentage rate, and it went up. This is 07 I'm talking about. They borrowed it at what's called an adjustable rate mortgage. They maybe had a 5% interest initially, and then 2 years later, this kicks in. Look at what happens. Oh. You just paid $900,000 in interest. And that's why so many homes collapsed. You understand? Like people couldn't pay for it. They just could not pay. Look at your monthly bill. Your bill went from $750 a month to $3,000 a month. And so that's why you folks must understand you should never, ever borrow money without knowing how the interest rate will affect you over the course of the borrowing. You understand? And I am a huge believer in developing early credit that's good and then getting a fixed rate loan that and if interest rates go lower, then refinance. But don't borrow money at a variable rate because it's going to kill you if interest rates change. And people telling you otherwise are just full of it. All right. So anywho, the point of all of this is that for the first time in the history of our country, a reasoned group of people can determine the monetary supply. You understand? These people have the obligation of determining how much money is in circulation. So this is a genuine, and we were starting down that path with the National Banking Act, which was created by Lincoln, right? But we didn't quite get there. Now, I did want to show you something that's also cool. Let me see if I can show you this here. If you go to the Federal Reserve and you wonder what happens with money when the government takes it out of circulation, let's see. Take a look at this. You guys see this? It's hilarious. Like this is money, like real money from the Fed in New York that I got when I was up there. So they actually run $100 bills and $50 bills and $10 bills, $20 through the shredders. They just shred it. Oh yeah. And so yeah, this is money, like real money that's been shredded in the Fed in New York. So they want to keep the money in circulation, and this is why it matters when like Pablo Escobar had $1 billion in U.S. cash down in Colombia, because it's actual money out of circulation, like the real money went out of our country, right? So where cash is matters. So let's get back to this this topic of the Fed, which is, again, we'll learn more about it in government next year. But the key thing about the Fed, and this is something you can write down if you want, is the Fed has three methods in which it can control the amount of money in circulation. Three means of determining how much money there is. First is setting the discount rate that banks charge to each other. So every day, banks borrow money from each other. I know that sounds weird, but that's just reality. And so the discount rate is set by the Fed. Okay. Secondly, if the Fed feels like, and by the way, if they want to decrease the amount of money in circulation, what do they do to the interest rate? They raise interest rates. That's exactly right. If they want to expand the monetary supply, they lower interest rates, because that means we all go out and borrow, or we use our credit card at 1% or whatever. So then we're like, yay, go borrow. All right. And that's exactly how our economy works. We borrow money and we purchase stuff. okay? And particularly big items, because our economy needs people working in construction. Well, that means we need people buying houses, right? We need to be buying vehicles, trucks, and for the economy to run well. The second thing is if there's too much money in circulation, the Fed can say, all right, banks, you have to raise your reserve requirements. One of the things that happened in 07 was reserve requirements were too low and banks were loaning out too much of their capital, which means if someone comes to the bank all at once, classic run on the bank, there's not enough money there, right? So that's important. They can raise the amount of money you have to have. And third, they can, and this is what our government has been doing for the last 3 years, big time, is buying up federal debt. Now, that sounds weird, right? It's so hard to explain to people how one part of the government is buying the debt of another part of the government, right? So when you think about the $28 trillion national debt, a large amount of that debt is held by the Federal Reserve. And so if they sell that on open market operations, then that means other people can buy U.S. bonds, right? Well, what they've been doing is to help battle inflation, buying up U.S. bonds, all right, taking money and kind of holding on to it so that we don't have inflation. So this is called open market operations. But I definitely want you to know the Federal Reserve, okay? And this was like I said, a landmark, crucial bill, and but it still exists. We are fully part of the Federal Reserve System over 100 years later. And if anything else, this is a huge, career bump for Woodrow Wilson, like one of his great success stories. I did want to take you back to that idea of the income tax. And now I need to update this, I think, one more time. But after President Trump's tax changes, what we're looking at here are how you have a progressive income tax. And some Americans don't understand this. So like take me, I make about, before taxes, $50,000 a year, okay? Which puts me right here in the 22% tax bracket. But I pay my family's health insurance, which is $10,000 a year, okay? I pay out of my account the family mortgage, which is completely tax deductible, the interest that you pay on. So by the time my deductions are over, I also get, I have 2 dependents, 2 children, deduct those, I'm now taxed, guess where? 12%. That's a huge difference, right? So even though I make $50,000, because of the money I spend, the government allows me to have these deductions to pay less taxes. Well, let's say I didn't. Let's say I didn't do that with taxes, right? Well, take a look, because this confuses people. When you ask people what percentage they pay in taxes, a lot of foolish people will tell you the highest percent, but they're lying to you. So let's say you make over $500,000, right? Right up here. Well, you would say I pay 37% in taxes, right? Wrong. On your first 10,000, you pay 10%. On your next 30,000, you pay 12%. So that's why it's a progressive income tax. The tax stays for those dollar amounts. So what you actually have to do is calculate your actual tax rate, not your highest tax bracket rate, right? Because the only amount of taxes you're going to pay that is 37% is the amount over $510,000. You don't pay 37% on this stuff. So, Americans see these things, or they hear in the 1950s, the highest tax bracket was 90%. They're like, oh my God, people had to pay 90% in taxes? Yeah, like 8 people or something, it was not typical. So that's kind of what people don't understand about the progressive tax, is that you pay this percent for each column. So, 10% here on that amount. And sure, there are Americans who nobody wants to pay a third of their income in taxes, right? But that is, when you hear about Americans' tax penalty or tax burden, the amount of taxes paid, amount of income taxed in Europe is on average, well, that's an income tax. I don't want that. I want the tax rate. Yeah, here it is. 30% in France. So that's for 70,000 francs or more, or euros. So they have income taxes in Europe too, right? But you're usually not going to find, if you look through here, the highest I see is Croatia, and that's 40%. Right here. Here are the Czechs with 50. So there are high tax rates in socialized countries, but we pay a fairly high tax rate here in our country, and we're not socialized. So the question, not fully. So the question becomes, Why? Why do we pay such a, well, first of all, if you're in poverty, you don't pay any taxes. Like these right here get all their income tax back. Everything below 22, 3,000, they get it all back. So, and then we haven't talked yet and aren't going to talk in depth today about what are called payroll taxes. Payroll taxes are what pays for Social Security and Medicare, and that's not that stuff. What you're looking at here is the income tax. Got it? But the payroll tax is completely different. You don't get that back until you collect Social Security and Medicare. And so we're funding someone else's Social Security and Medicare. So that's our tax system that is going to emerge from this. Now, our third key piece of legislation is the Clayton Antitrust Act, and the creation also of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. And both of these both this law and the FTC are designed to put even more teeth into what was considered by Wilson the impotent Sherman Act. Now, I will say that the Sherman Act was used by by President Roosevelt, but what Wilson believed really, and if you read in the text, I think it talks about this too. It includes other things that are objectionable. It says here, like price discrimination, which is illegal now, but it also, and I think you maybe want to write this down. I should add this to this list. It exempted labor, organized labor, from antitrust suits. So if you remember, the Sherman Act was most frequently used to go after labor unions, which is, they claim we're operating in restraint of trade. And so now that's going to not be the case anymore. Okay. So New Freedom has some major progressive accomplishments. And I think much of that's due to the fact that the Dems controlled both houses. Now, there are other laws that are going to be passed during those first couple of years of legislation. And I don't need to elaborate each one of those here in class, in the recording. I would pay particular note to the Workingmen's Compensation Act. All right, so you want to write this down. Federal employees got disability coverage. See, the thing about the federal government is the federal government a lot of times doesn't have the authority to tell the public sector stuff. Right? The private sector, I should say. But the federal government can pretty much tell federal government employees whatever they want. And so if they want to provide workman's comp for federal employees, can they do it? Sure. Does anybody know what the very first thing in America that was officially desegregated? 1947, Harry Truman will desegregate the U.S. Armed Forces with a stroke of a pen. He can desegregate the Army because he's the commander in chief. He can say blacks and whites will serve in the military together. He couldn't sign a piece of paper and say blacks and whites will go to school together, right? So, if you understand how the presidency works, the presidency can't just tell people what to do out here in the public. If President Biden walked in here, I'd be like, hey, President Biden, but he couldn't tell me what to do. That's not how it works. He's my employee, but he could tell federal employees what to do, right? Because he's their employee. They're his employees, so to speak. That makes sense. So workman's compensation, if you understand, if you get injured on the job, is an awesome thing that you have coverage. You're protected for that. So it's a form of insurance that, that's crucial. So I would definitely know that. So let's keep going under Wilson. Wilson is, I think, one of the best examples of the ability to use the White House for his own, his sort of objectives that he needs without overreach too much. The problem for Wilson and for Americans, they grew tired. And not just Wilson. Wilson has other problems that are going to rise up. And the big thing that most sort of stops progressivism in its tracks is World War I. World War I comes along, you got to focus on something else now. But people began to become tired of it, all right? So, keep in mind the progressives emerged during the Panic of 1893 primarily. And so they were responding to the injustices of corporate, industry. Well, by the 19-teens, more and more Americans are doing better. Dig? All right? The fact that progressives, and this goes back to all reform movements, want to solve every problem, it seems like. I have a list of 5 things that are my objectives to work for. 5. I won't get into every debate about everything that needs to be repaired, fixed, reformed. there are a gazillion things that can be reformed and fixed. So I have my own priorities. And next year in APUSH, in AP government, you'll have an opportunity to rank out of all the federal issues, which ones are important to you. And so you just can't spend all your energy on everything. And in reality, while corporations were somewhat tamed, they were still very much in charge of getting people elected. But, I look down here and I'm reminded that what Wilson and TR start, FDR is really going to carry over into full fruition. So if you think about the success of TR and Wilson, it will take somebody like FDR to absolutely redefine how America operates. So FDR is like revolutionary. TR and Wilson, I would argue, are evolutionary. They're headed in a different direction. So a couple questions down here. I mentioned Louis Brandeis as a Supreme Court justice who was appointed by President Wilson, who was progressive and was Jewish. And that was very important. This was a guy from Mueller v. Oregon case. And then I also have the major limit to Wilson's progressivism is in the area of civil rights for African Americans. Like, he absolutely was not progressive in that area. Secondarily, he was not progressive when it came to women's rights, but he did change his mind on women. Like, in other words, during World War I, the protests against his presidency were so loud by women that he started listening. And by the end of his presidency, he will support the ratification of the 19th Amendment. But that's, I know that's a very crash course on Woodrow Wilson, but really, usually when asked on an AP exam, it's these things. It's write about new freedom if you get a domestic policy question. So now we have to shift gears to foreign policy. And, Wilson, it's so bizarre to me how history repeats itself, right? Wilson, like Jefferson, will have much of his presidency defined by something he didn't want it to be defined by. If you go back to Thomas Jefferson, the dominant thing in America under Thomas Jefferson was the Napoleonic Wars, right? Well, Wilson has zero experience with foreign policy, right? He's been the governor of New Jersey. He's never served in the military. And yet he is going to have to deal with a very, very difficult period in American history. Now, I will point out this. Wilson absolutely despised imperialism. So recall, he both hated what happened during the Spanish-American War, but he also overtly rejects dollar diplomacy. So when he comes into office, he just kills dollar diplomacy right away. Like that idea is dead in the water. All right. And so the next thing he's going to do, which is pretty amazing, is he's going to allow the Panamanians to start charging tolls to us on the Panama Canal. It's called the Panama Tolls Act, right? But one of the things that he does with William Jennings Bryan is began to support the independence of the Philippines. These guys want to get out of the Philippines, right? So you have a law passed called the Jones Act that's going to allow territorial status to the Philippines and the promise of independence in the future. But in the end, Wilson is going to, as I think the book says, have to eat his words. This anti-imperialist is going to get involved in several different issues. Okay, most notably is going to be in Mexico. Now, I mentioned, and I'll just jump down here. Under Wilson, we're going to end up sending troops to Haiti, the Dominican, and we're going to purchase the Virgin Islands. So, this whole we'll keep out of your business thing doesn't pay off. We don't actually do that. If you look up here, look at how many times we're going to send intervention into Cuba. All right. But by far the most important is going to be Mexico. Okay. So in 1913, the democratically elected president of Mexico is assassinated or murdered. Francisco Madero is killed by this guy. Now, this is the name you need to first learn, and his name is Victoriano Huerta. I always think of the word, I think it's Huerta, M-U, as a kind of a synonym for this person, not a dead woman, but a dead person. This guy means death. Huerta means death, means killing. And when he takes over, virtually all the major all the revolutionary leaders in Mexico go after him and go after his government. So you have lots and lots of leadership of various groups. Now, I asked you on here who spoke and demanded that we get involved, right? The answer is William Randolph Hearst. So you guys remember Hearst, Yellow Journalism? Hearst, who has this huge ranch down there, has huge holdings, huge U.S. possessions in Mexico, and he demands U.S. intervention. And of course, Wilson says no way initially. All right, Wilson's like, I'm not sending troops down there because a rich guy might lose his land. Not my problem, right? And so Wilson is trying to ignore this stuff, okay, as best he can. Unfortunately, Huerta has basically started a civil war in Mexico, okay? And there is the leading rival to Huerta is this fellow right here, Venustiano Carranza. And I got pictures of these dudes right here. So I don't have Carranza, sorry. But here's Carranza who got killed. Later, I do have Carranza, sorry. He's going to get murdered too. By the way, guys, if you don't know the story of Mexico, we've talked about Santa Anna, right? That guy was president 11 times in 22 years. And, you know, the first leader of Mexican independence was killed. They keep going back and forth between these dictators called caudillos and sort of elected democratically people who usually get overthrown. So it's like the history of Mexico is a lot of this stuff, okay? Unfortunately, people are fleeing from Mexico into the United States, refugees. And then a group of American sailors get arrested. This is called the Tampico incident, all right? The U.S. gets involved, and Wilson is not going to allow Americans to be killed or captured or held hostage. And so he says, all right, you guys, mess with me. And that means Wilson is going to send down a force. And we'll see this in a minute. You do have a group who try to intervene. I hadn't updated this in a while, so I need to. That are called the ABC powers. Argentina, Brazil, and Chile try to negotiate because they don't want U.S. invasion, right? They don't want Central America to become occupied basically by the United States. We're going to send aid to Carranza, like financial aid to Carranza, guns and stuff like that. And eventually, the war is going to get worse, but most notably, this guy, and I want to point him out to you here. This guy, Pancho Villa, who was originally one of our dudes, against Huerta, is now at war against Carranza, okay? And he invades the United States. He's one of the few people in history who attack America on American soil. Pancho Villa brings a raiding party, and they come in he's sort of holed up in Mexico, in a northern province, and he invades New Mexico and kills some Americans. And so this fella here, this is John J. Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, he was nicknamed, is in command of American forces. And we are going to dispatch an entire army into Mexico in what is called the Mexican Punitive Expedition. And this is really a war. We invade Mexico and are going after Pancho Villa. So it's called the Mexican Punitive Expedition. And my great-grandfather was in on it. I have a picture of him at home where he's in his cavalry uniform. He rode with Blackjack Pershing, and Pershing and the U.S. forces, I'm trying to find a good picture here. This will do, though, are going to spend the next 2 years hunting for Pancho Villa. Now, if you ever wanted a good example of how hard it is to capture people, Pancho Villa is a perfect example. So he's holed up, and I forget which state it is in Mexico, which territory, but he's holed up down there, and the people adore him. He's like a warlord, and they don't let him get captured. They send out information, and we're looking all through Mexico to find this guy, and we can't get you, and so he's like the most wanted criminal. Meanwhile, Carranza wins over his competitors, right? So he's in office, but the problem is it's now 1917. So now we have a whole other issue to deal with. Well, we never catch Pancho Villa. He'll be executed by a rival warlord. So I don't know if you guys are following at all what's going on in Mexico near the border, but before there were drug kingpins, there were still kingpins. And so today, the cartels in Mexico have basically just taken over the land and have the same sort of power over the states, several of the states. And so Mexico is having a very difficult time wresting power away from these people, right? And so American military planners now have studied the Mexican punitive expedition on how to deal with fighting the drug war against these cartels, right? And so these guys weren't drug dealers, but unfortunately they were so brutal, we couldn't help but pay attention. This was too much of a story. Now, in the end, Blackjack Pershing, this general, will be ordered. I got to tell you, a terrible thing happens while he's in Mexico. He's pursuing Pancho Villa, and his base of operations is a presidio in California. It's a fort in California. And he's called up to go see President Wilson. And the day before he's supposed to leave to go see Wilson, he gets a telegram that his wife and 3 daughters have burned to death in a fire. So General Pershing suffers a disastrous tragedy. His only living family member will be his son, who was at a neighbor's house when the fire breaks out. So he's recalled, and Wilson is going to meet with him to deal with the crisis in Europe. So we don't ever really resolve the problem of Pancho Villa. And then the problem of, Carranza was a decent guy, but he's going to get murdered by this guy. No, not by, I forget which guy kills Carranza. So they just keep going back and forth. So you can see this is just so confusing. All I need you to do is understand that Wilson gets dragged into this thing in Mexico, right? Like Jefferson gets pulled into the conflict in Europe. We can't ignore problems in Mexico, right? It's too close to home. And in the end, Pershing would be, the story if he had successfully caught him, but he doesn't. And instead, he has to be recalled to deal with what's going on in Europe. Okay. So this is, by the way, why Princeton's School of International Studies is named after Woodrow Wilson. Wilson overtly rejects imperialism. Like he absolutely says that it's bad. And he champions the idea that democracy should be around the world. So remember I told you he was kind of like a preacher? He is a firm believer in preaching the American values should spread around the world, but not as imperialistic, but because people are selecting it, are choosing to, his words, self-govern, right? So when we get into World War I, most of you are already familiar with something called the 14 points, right? Maybe not. All right, I'm seeing some blank looks here. So Wilson's 14 points, which are his strategy to remake a world order. And we are very much living in Woodrow Wilson's world when it comes to internationalism. Wilson is what we would call an internationalist. So just like TR, in a sense, these two men have a vision of America's role in the world. Now, TR extends it through power, right, through the Navy, through the Army. Wilson wants to spread it as peace. In fact, if you make his most famous quote about World War I is to make the world safe for what? Oh, wow. Safe for democracy, right? Like make the world safe for democracy. That's his reasoning for fighting World War I. So definitely be aware of these incursions. And again, I would tell you that they go against Wilson's ideals, and that is not unusual. We talked about Thomas Jefferson having to go against his own ideals, right? So are we one of the boys, so to speak? Are we an imperialist country or not? So I'm going to stop with that for today and take up the story of World War I tomorrow, all right? I feel like it's too much story to process all of this and World War I. Picture of which? Well, oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, what do you see here that you like? What's on it?
That's
a TV show?
Yep.
Which one?
Boys.
Well, I think the thing about this that's interesting is you can see down here, like I told you, we got the Virgin Islands, right? Remember that? So by now we have gotten Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and we've got a base in Cuba. And so we're very much part of this community, right? Like we're part of this region. And, the debate becomes really about what is America's role? Are we an imperialist or are we a protector? You see the difference? Do we offer protection or are we imperialistic? And so if you look up here, you can see the chip foreign intervention, right? And you can see Cuba, Puerto Rico. So, for Wilson, this is one of the most frustrating things because he doesn't really want to have to deal with foreign policy. What does he want to do? He wants to be a progressive leader. But he's got another problem. And I think we should probably talk about that for a minute. Let's just go ahead now and mention his reelection. So his reelection is going to be in 1916, right? So I'm going to tell you the reason he gets reelected now. I don't even know if I have a 1916 election slide. So let me see if I can pull this up. And I certainly will talk about it more in the future, but I feel like it's good to have it now. So he's going to run against a progressive governor named Charles Evans Hughes. But this time, what's the question is on everybody's mind is you guys remember Wilson was a minority president, right? Well, if you know anything about the year 1916, what has been that doesn't look good. What has been going on for 2 years now? Oh, that's a bomb. World War I. That's exactly right. World War I has been going on for 2 years. And he is going to run on he kept us out of war. Boy, ain't that ironic, right? And Americans overwhelmingly. Now, keep in mind, he's going to win who sort of de facto? Who does he automatically win because he's a Democrat? He's South. Remember, Democrats in the South, they call them yellow dog Democrats because, blue dog Democrats, because they'd rather vote for, if they had to vote for a Republican, they'd vote for a blue dog before they voted for a Republican. You understand? So they're like committed Democrats down South. They don't even pay attention to the Republicans, right? Like they just go pull the lever. The West is where the nation's isolation has started. So in Idaho, Senator Bora, he's out there. Senator Johnson's out. So the West is just the stronghold. It's not agrarianism that gets Wilson the reelection. But he doesn't win the West because of populism. He wins the West because he kept us what? Out of war. And then what happens the next year? We enter World War I. Right? Yeah, so in 1970. Yeah, it's a big year. We have hundreds of thousands of Americans killed in that war. People forget that, we were in it for a year, but it was a high cost. It was a deadly war. So nonetheless, he's going to win re-election over Charles Evans Hughes. And, America is going to breathe a sigh of relief because they think we're not going to enter World War I, right? We're going to be safe. And situations change. And Wilson said, I'm going to paraphrase here, but something along the lines of, it would be a terrible thing to lead this great nation into war. He just doesn't want to do that. But when we get to World War I, starting tomorrow, you'll see that really America had no choice based on the events that occurred. I'm not going to say they had no choice, but based on the events that occurred, we've talked about casus belli, right? Like reasons for war. We had more than enough reasons to have to go to war. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording now, and